events are really great. It's exciting to be back here. This is my third year in a row doing something new, maybe fourth. And you know, what I'm here to share with you is some of my background experience and perspectives on how to make permaculture design something that's useful, relevant to how it is we go about growing truly deeply nourishing sustenance for ourselves as human beings on this planet, and thinking in a more comprehensive way perhaps than simply near-term objectives of, say, mathematics and trying to look at really linear concepts like yield breaker grain, which is generally how ChemAg makes the argument that they can outstrip production capacities of something that's not utilizing chemicals, as it's a single crop yield criteria, which is a reductionist model to begin with. So what I'll be exploring is how do we use this discipline of permaculture to design how we go about doing this activity that's called farming in a way that actually begins to benefit biodiversity and diversity of jobs that are available for local communities simultaneously. Because it seems to me that it's important that we start to make the connection between jobs, income, and how to do that in a way that is truly restorative of the places where we live, rather than having jobs and income be extractive, destructive, and degrading to other places than where we live, and have the places where we live be maintained with vast quantities of fossil fuel inputs to be kept looking the way that they do, with no real function to the landscape. The landscape has been reduced to an aesthetic value in the privileged class G20 nations at a vast expense to the rest of the world and ourselves. And so permaculture looks more deeply and says, well, what are the true costs? When we say, you know, what does something cost? Are we just using the reductionist model of dollars and cents, or are we talking about things that actually you can't put a dollar value on? Like the genetic integrity of our children. Is the way in which we're living compromising the health and quality of life for all future generations who will come into existence on this planet? Is it conceivable that as an individual human being who's alive here and now, that it might be partially a opportunity and a responsibility to be more aware of our relationships to everything? And is it conceivable that we could design farms and how it is we go about doing things that are income producing, do make dollars and cents, with this more depth of a perspective being in the program of how it is we go about meeting those near-term goals. And permaculture design, why I find it resonating, why I've graduated, for instance, 600 students in New York City alone in the last 7 years through a permaculture design certification course there that is a one-of-a-kind of that sort of program, in that it's very urban-centric, it's very obsessed with the Northeastern Corridor, and how do we actually retrofit this entire infrastructure to not be a toxic nightmare for ourselves and our families, where we eke out a modicum of a decent existence. Honestly, right? In the face of Superfund sites, chronic non-compliance with the Clean Air Act, contaminated waterways, nuclear legacies of radioactive waste piling up at all these power plants so we can have light bulbs and computers at night. You might ask ourselves, is that really necessary in order to fuel the wheels of agriculture? Do we have to have oil extraction? Do we have to have all of these high input, long distance transportation infrastructures intact in order for us to have a farm? Doesn't that ultimately make our farm actually very vulnerable and arguably entirely unsustainable, even at the most rudimentary definition of sustainable? You know, as some thinkers say, sustainable, it has too many syllables. And if I ask you how your relationship was going and you said sustainable, I'd have to say I'm sorry. And that's to kind of highlight how mediocre sustainable is. Nobody's interested in just being sustainable. We're interested in having a joyous, exuberant existence where we imbibe the vitality of being living organisms on the planet. Not just some, well, we're making it and we've got a low flow shower head and we've got compact fluorescent light bulbs, which are a huge don't let anybody delude you. Those things are a toxic nightmare. They make absolutely no design sense. They've just been foisted on the public because the corporate green sector can sell you that product. So, how do we redesign farming to make it make sense in terms of something that's knowable? Like there are measurable ways in which there are clear quantifiable benchmarks by which we can tell whether we're succeeding when we do good design. Good design of a house, good design of a farm, all are reflected by measurable, knowable variables like, is biodiversity increasing? Is water quality increasing? Have I created habitat for songbirds and pollinators while at the same time I'm getting a yield? This is the world of permaculture in the sense that it's combining the love of a naturalist with the love of a gardener. And it's saying if we really are human beings who love being alive on this earth, then we're going to recognize that the way we're going to live and the way we're going to grow food is going to be entirely different than when we're coming at it from a paradigm of extraction, reduction, and quantifiable variables that have only dollars and cents and profit margins that are driven by a very shallow set of criteria. So when we expand our criteria and don't operate by the shallow methods of the society and instead think more comprehensively and say, well, if we actually value things like the fact that it's a finite planet, that we're in outer space circling around the sun right now at 65,000 miles per hour, that everything on the planet, according to astrophysicists, came from the center of a star in another solar system before this planet ever came into existence. Which means that everything in the silica molecule in your soil, in your thumbnail, was in the center of a star before it was ever on planet Earth. Which means that if you just sit and do less, you automatically know more than everybody who's trying to do a lot and thinks they know something. There's innate wisdom in doing nothing. Right? I remember there was this book that was called The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment. And permaculture is absolutely that. It totally is. Permaculture is saying this whole idea that being environmental means you're being purgative, ascetic, and deprivational of your real hedonistic sensuality is absolutely misguided. And when you try to sell an ethic of earth responsibility under this aegis of I'm now becoming more ascetic, I am now this like yogic trained vegan, that's the opposite of what permaculture is saying. It's saying actually enjoy sleeping in your hammock at noon a little bit more and have a free lunch because the way in which your farm works 10 years after you started designing it is a lot easier than the amount of work it took in the first 3 to 5 years. So how do we leverage our activity to accelerate its success by virtue of the fact that it cooperates with how the earth actually works, which is a knowable thing. We know how the earth works, to a degree that's good enough that we can move forward with creating farm landscapes that really work well with the underlying dynamic of evolution and natural selection, which is the real variable that we want to make sure we're, as a species, doing things intelligently. That's really, to a degree, I suggest how we can define what is intelligent. It's not intelligent if it compromises the air, water, soil, and genetic integrity of all life on Earth. I can tell you that. And so therefore, correspondingly, what is intelligent is anything that actually enhances the vitality and quality of air, water, soil, and human health and well-being. Anything that doesn't do that is a bad idea. And as soon as you start to really just be simple and sort of what I jokingly call caveman lawyer mentality about this kind of stuff, and you say, obviously, that's a truism. That's an absolute truth, as we call it in philosophy. You might want to try to debate that with me, but you would lose. Because there is no doubt about it that the fundament of life is the air we breathe, the water we drink, right? It's really the four elements. Earth, air, water, fire is the big one that's gotten out of control for our species, and that we're not really in touch with and actually sitting around fires at night, hanging out with our friends and having the real beauty of being alive on this planet be something that we're immersed in. Because we're often into this entertainment industry of everybody being stimulated by the box and not actually just being alive and saying, I'd rather be more outside with my friends sitting around a fire at night, eating something that, you know, maybe a little fawn got roadkill by a car as you were hanging out there and you quickly skinned it, slaughtered it, and fried it up as fillets for your dinner. Because there's a lot of abundance on this planet, and there's a lot of fear that people have, and we need to get rid of both of those things, because none of them really avail us when it comes to moving forward with redesigning how we do agriculture, so that this activity of farming and gardening and providing more abundance for ourselves actually becomes fundamentally restorative to the foundation of all life. So how can we garden and farm in a way that actually enhances the entire web of life that our farms and gardens inherently live in a relationship to? And we as a species live in a relationship to this web. And we can choose to either be conscious of it and intentional, or we can be unconscious of it and destructive. And that's up to us. That's our choice. And so permaculture is about an intention and saying we do have a knowable variable. We come from the center of a star in another solar system, and we are now beings on this planet that have over 4.5 billion years of evolution that's gone into us to make it possible for us to be here today and ask questions that are more useful questions than perhaps we might be distracted by, like who won a sports event, but actually be curious about things like where did we come from as a species and how have we been doing so well on this planet as an organism? And are there patterns that emerge as we start to ask these deeper questions? So the single largest thing going on planet Earth is without a doubt the sun. And we're on a far arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and it is a small sun that in maybe another 5 billion years will go red giant and extinguish all life on the Earth. So maybe by then we should have figured out how to farm and garden on Mars. Or some other planet in another solar system with a sun that's going to last a little longer. So I always say the way to really think about this at a meta design level is first to contextualize what you're doing on your farm, to say, where are we doing it, and why are we doing it in that way, and how can we know that we're going to get more leverage because we're doing it in a way that's really informed by things like geology and hydrology and native plant and animal populations, as well as knowing the history of plants that have been domesticated and animals that have been domesticated. And by being a sort of lay scholar and a farmer and a gardener, we can start to, in the wintertime, throw together a design for our farm. A design that makes sense in terms of where we are on planet Earth, and in terms of how evolution works, and knowing our landscape, right? 10,000 years ago, scoured down to rock by glacial ice sheets that were coming across from the northern latitudes. And that's a defining characteristic of these landscapes. Right? We know that the Hadley Loam was created because of a unique east-west ridge that blocked a glacier that caused it to drop out the silty sediments. So it defines the landscapes where we are. It's what we call the bones of the landscape, is the geology. So it's knowable what makes sense where in the landscape in terms of where are the places that are good for what types of plants, what types of animals, where is it appropriate to be doing grazing of livestock, where is it not appropriate, where is it appropriate to be doing intensive woodlot management for timber crops, where is it not appropriate, where can we do it and how can we do it in ways that actually enhance biodiversity and make sense for where we are on the planet. And we want to recognize that why we're leveraging and want to partner with biodiversity is for two reasons. It gives us this bank of fallback opportunities when we have the die-off of certain members of our farm that aren't able to weather hardship that happens. Because no matter what, whether you want to be catastrophic and extremist and talk about climate chaos, the reality is it's a dynamic ride on planet Earth. And you always want to have a good design of your farm ecosystem to be suited to the fact that we're going to have droughts, we're going to have floods, we're going to have hurricanes, and you should plan on it as far as thinking about what's your yield during a hard year. What are we banking on that's really going to give us a fallback? And that's why we're looking at this mechanism of how does nature deal with the vicissitudes of how evolution has happened on this planet. By having a bunch of different life forms that something's going to be able to ride that wave and come back after the severe die-off event has happened of some sort, many of which have happened throughout Earth's history. Right? Earth is an evolutionary organism that has seen many severe impact events. They in fact think that the moon was created by a planet about half the size of the Earth slamming into the Earth about 2 billion years ago. So very fascinating when you just start to unpack sort of what is the scientific story of the planet, and how do we then, through our fascination with this, start to redesign how we farm and garden to make sense in terms of some longer term patterns that we can see. And that's where permaculture both points to saying we need an ethic of earth responsibility and earth care, and people care emerges from a really healthy way of living on this earth. And that correspondingly, those two things are interrelated. In order to heal the people, we have to heal the earth. In order to heal the earth, we have to heal the people. And they're all interconnected. And so ultimately, we're saying the social solution that permaculture is excited about is how do we make sure that everybody on the planet has more than enough in terms of good air to breathe, good water to drink, good food to eat, a caring and loving community to support them when they're down and out and need support. We're saying ultimately that's our eco-ideal. Or another way of putting it that I like to frame it is to say, how can we love all the species of all the children through all time? So that we're looking at a design paradigm that has a different set of values. Instead of this notion that we have to be separatist in order to survive, it's an expansive consciousness that says actually you have to give away more than you take in order to do well. And where we learn that from is looking at nature. We're saying, well, look at a plant. A plant takes in all of the sunlight it takes in, it converts into sugars and enzymes, and it releases 70% of them in general back to this microbiological community that its roots live within. So in order for a plant to survive, it has to give away 70% of what it takes in. That might be a good formula for us to practice in our livelihoods. But seriously, that is what permaculture is looking at. It's saying, this planet has been doing well under these particular circumstances. This is an image of the Earth from NASA photography, and they're saying that through infrared images, they can tell that there are certain places on the planet that are generally cool, and there are certain places that are generally hot. And one of our basic objectives here is to get that comfortable ride in outer space, and in order to do that, we don't want the Earth to get too hot. And so the best way to keep the Earth from getting too hot is to rebuild mature, diverse ecosystems. It becomes a sort of design protocol. If you recognize that the thing that's doing the most robust work for you as far as what we call ecosystem services is mature, diverse ecosystems, then you start to say, okay, so as a species, how do we start to recreate, rebuild, and replant mature, diverse ecosystems? That means old growth forests, things like this, right? 99% of which have been cut down in North America. Less than 1% is left. Most of the East Coast has been clear cut 3 to 4 times consecutively. So in terms of like negative downward spiral impacts of having mature, diverse ecosystems be part of our management protocols, we have been squandering our inheritance, is how we put this. We say, you know, we're not apologetic about it, we're not accusatory about it in permaculture, we're just sort of transparent about it. Like, the reality is, the mode of operation has been a colonial conquer-exploiter culture that's been taking and burning and cutting down forests at rates that are entirely unsustainable for, in many instances, at least 500 years. Exorbitantly for the last 500 years, but in many instances going back over thousands of years, depending on where you look on planet Earth. And so what permaculture is saying is, let's get a pattern of civilization design that borrows from the best hits that worked and amalgamate them to meet what our modernist sensibilities are now in the postmodern age. We're not trying to do one or the other. We're not looking to some Rousseauian romanticization of hunter-gatherer society that actually banks on a vast die-off of many people, because it's the only way you could actually support a population that's not 7 billion people on a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So permaculture is saying, so how do we even increase the carrying capacity of the Earth? How do we make it so planet Earth not only does a better job at giving us that comfortable ride, but provides us with more of a free lunch by virtue of these landscapes that we plant out and restore? And that's why it starts to geek out and nerd out as a discipline on these forest gardens. Because permaculture is saying, well, some of the longest lived, largest organisms that give us the greatest yields over many lifetimes are trees. So and we have people like J. Russell Smith, who was a geography professor at Columbia in the 1920s. He went around the world and studied places like Corsica and showed that, in fact, chestnuts outproduced corn if we were looking at calories per acre, fats per acre, and oils that could be made. No doubt about it. And was suggesting to the USDA at that time in Kentucky that chestnuts and tree crops, carob and all kinds of things he had researched that he said could do well throughout Kentucky. And he was saying to the USDA, look, the science shows if you start to look over decades, these way outproduce these annual crops. And this was in the 1920s. So in effect, the math, the science, the academic work has largely already been done. So it's kind of interesting to me that in some instances universities are reinventing the wheel and say, well, we need to really study agroforestry. I'm like, actually, a professor of geography at Columbia in 1924 wrote a seminal text called Tree Crops that Bill Mullison borrowed a great deal of ideas from and comped on. And it's really important that we give credit to where is the thread of where this concept of a polyculture perennial agriculture, which is what permaculture is saying. Look, what is permanent agriculture? A polyculture, not a monoculture. More perennials, not such dependence on animals. So it's saying, let's start to balance what's been an imbalance. And it's not trying to be extremist and say, oh, we're all going to become hunter-gatherers and just eat fish and game, or we're all going to now eat grains and eat no meat because it's somehow more ethical. Of course, that's only if you're feeding grains to livestock, which many of these heritage varieties should be eating 100% grass. So that whole perspective changes when that's your reason for vegetarianism, which it is for many people. We're taking food from people because we're feeding grain to meat. No, not in a healthy farm. You're not feeding grain to your livestock, or very, very rarely, or maybe a tiny amount when you're milking them. But even that could be alfalfa meal. I mean, for instance, American milking dairy, heritage breed, triple purpose breed, 100% grass. That cow does not ever want you to feed it grain. And they're triple purpose, which means that the offspring from them are turn into good burgers if they're boys, because that's what you do with the boys. And the heifers are going to be able to also haul some logs out of the woods for you, like 6 hours a day, and not drop off in milk production. What's that? And they make the highest butterfat milk. It's a higher butterfat than Jersey. Right? So and why heritage breeds? Because heritage breeds naturalize more to the landscapes. Why is permaculture into naturalizing? Because we want to start to create farms that have become more adapted to where they are. So we're looking at this meta level and saying all those ideas really permutate from basically a more contextual understanding of who we are as a species, what's the history of agriculture, and how can we really start to do a better job of it. Without trying to be extremist, without trying to be judgmental. None of that's really productive, but instead being creative and being deductive and not spending a lot of time on details, only where those details are relevant. So mature diverse ecosystems. Physiographic provinces, one of my favorite historical references. This is a combination of physical geology and geography. So again, a couple scientists in the 20s got together and said, let's combine these two fields and let's create a map of the entire country that breaks it into places that share similar soils, similar climate, similar native animal and plant community, and use it as a bit of a template to start to design agriculture in the United States. In fact, J. Russell Smith wrote another book after tree crops just called North America. in North America, he's outlining how to adapt all agriculture in this country to make sense in terms of your physiographic province. And he's saying, you know, there are certain types of crops that make sense for the type of geology, the type of soils, the type of hydrology that the Great Plains have, and certain types of animals, right? So how many, here's an interesting bit of information. 4,000 species of plants have been domesticated throughout the course of human history. About 150 are widely cultivated. Just 4 provide 60% of the world's food. So that's a setup for famine, starvation, die-off. When you put that many eggs in one basket, that's bad design. And when you're that dependent on a global import, high energy input food system, that's a bad design. And the first thing we're dismantling is the food system, because it's kind of the gateway drug that's right now successful. Right? How successful? We're talking about 27 billion annual sales, GNP of the US economy, growing by 7% annually, organic sales. According to Glenwood, just in the Hudson Valley, somewhere around 178 million annual sales, might be 123 million, but it's a lot. And then their estimate of the ceiling for it, for just Hudson Valley, is 365 million or something like that. So, and that's interesting to recognize that there might be a 200 million level buying base of demand that right now is not being satisfied by any growers in the Northeast. And where they are being satisfied, this is one of the observations we make to inspire our students to be those entrepreneurs who create those products that meet that demand, which is what's exciting about this. Demand is far outstripping supply. When you say, could we do this in a way that makes more ecological sense? Could you design for us and start to deliver the goods on a better way of heating our house, of having dinner on the table at night? Absolutely. There are a lot more people now asking for high quality, truly regionally produced in a highly ethical way alternative. Alternative shirts, alternative bags, alternative educational opportunities, alternative baby clothes, you know. Like I have a 5-year-old baby girl. I don't know if she's a baby at 5, but awesome, amazing little human being who I'm getting the opportunity to hang out with and see day by day how she emerges into this world and nurturing that. And wanting to nurture a human being gets you in touch with realizing things like, I don't want anything on her skin that isn't healthy, right? So organic baby clothes, like most of them coming all the way from Germany. I remember this whole big event for us in our family was that this company in Germany decided they were going to stop selling on the US market because they're doing so crazy well in the EU, they don't even have to bother with distribution sales, so they just stop. And we're like, oh my goodness, we can't find the organic baby clothes anymore. Are you kidding me that there is no entrepreneur, no business person who says, I got an idea. Let's have heritage breed sheep that are suited to your physiographic province that you make organic baby clothes from, that's in the Hudson Valley, that's in anywhere in the Northeast that it's suited to that geology and that soil on your farm. All of a sudden, then you've got this niche market buying base. People would go crazy over organic, regionally produced baby clothing. Guaranteed, right? So there's ideas after ideas that just come out, and you start to realize, why isn't this happening? Well, because, and it is happening. It absolutely is happening. And that's a big part of what's exciting. And where I'm saying it's happening the most is in the food movement, right? So the CSAs, for instance, the USDA estimates are growing by things like 25% annually. So we're seeing numbers going from like 761 in the Northeast in 2001 to over 1,034 by 2004. It was a 3-year time period they were tracking it. I know that just 2 years ago, over 200 opened up in Long Island. So the rate of growth of regional food for real people, is exciting and creates now an opportunity to say, now let's really dial in how this regional food is being produced. Let's start to make it truly ecological. And let's get off all of these fossil fuels, tractor heavy, hybrid heavy, labor heavy, irrigation heavy systems insofar as we can, with finesse, with elegance, with intelligence. And that's why it becomes design. So we're saying, so where are we? What's the water and soil like? These ecoregions, again, that's why I say what I'm trying to bring to you is combining the kind of stuff that all these restoration ecologists who just get rabid about trying to annihilate plants that are here to help us and become part of our new economy, right? Think about this. If we didn't use petroleum to make bags and packaging, you would be amped about a plant like Japanese knotweed, purple loosestrife, kudzu, autumn because they're insane biomass producers, right? You can do cut and come again, cut and come again, cut and come again, throw it in, make a new bag out of it, make a new bag out of it, compost it, right? It's only because we think it's actually a good idea to try to eradicate this plant and use a Monsanto product. Are you kidding me? And voice that as if it's ecologically valuable work to do. Right? Well, I'm in the midst of, I've done restoration ecology, I've worked for land trusts, I've worked for watershed groups, I've had AmeriCorps teams removing multiflora rows from places where I think it makes sense, where there's nice trees trying to grow and it's slowing them down or maybe strangling them. Right? I know the way we want to move succession forward, and I understand the struggle with it, but what I see about these plants is that they're a resource, and they're a holding pattern. And most people who nerd out about local ecology are primarily just interested in ecology for ecology's sake, and that doesn't feed people. And that's where I say it's really interesting that what we're talking about is unique, because I'm one of the only speakers and thinkers saying that the world of conservation needs to merge with the world of agriculture. And that's an achievable goal, but it's not achievable if all you're trying to do is restore native biodiversity. Right? There are places where that's an intelligent objective. Riparian zones, wetlands, steep slopes and ridges and rocky areas, totally. But there are places in the landscape where we need intensive production of cultivated landscapes and ecologies, designed for the people and by the people. And what permaculture is saying is let's use the wisdom of a lot of this information from the restoration ecology movement, but let's combine it with the organic food, regional food movement that's also about production. And let's combine that with the permaculture community that's saying let's look at long-term polyculture tree crops integrated with your annuals and your livestock. And let's design farms to make sense in terms of what all these native plant people are saying, insofar as that's informative and useful for you. Right? It's just an information set. And right now, interestingly, it's an information set that primarily only people like the DEC and the Nature Conservancy are using. But again, I see those as indicators to us as lay people and grassroots movements of information sets that are compelling when we start to contextualize our farms in them. Because they're already valued by people who want to invest millions of dollars in putting that land under conservation easements and protecting it and dropping your taxes even further. So in other words, you can position what you're doing on your farm to interest a conservation group because of the fact that you thought about how to create a riparian buffer zone that both produces nuts for your Tejesas pork and cork that you're going to do and enhances the macroinvertebrate diversity of the stream that it's growing next to. Totally achievable goals. But interesting to me that there are very few thinkers that are interested in achieving that goal. Say, how do we combine the wisdom of what we've learned about how American beach produces a late leaf litter fall that feeds the caddisfly that makes it possible for brook trout to be in a stream, so that we don't ever want to see a bare stream bank with cattle grazing right up to it. That's always a bad idea. And we always want to think about how to have trees in the place where they make sense to control floods, to control erosion, to keep livestock from getting hoof and mastitis problems and breaking their ankle on the steep bank of an eroded stream that's flowing through the middle of a pasture. Always a bad idea, right? And it's interesting that generally it only gets responded to when a farmer is willing to say, look, things are so trashed where my cattle are. Would you, the USDA, please fund putting in a fence, planting a bunch of trees, and creating a single access crossway? Because you're the USDA NRCS leftover vestige of the Soil Conservation Service that still has funding to do things with riparian zones. But no thought in that riparian zone to nut trees that could also be a value-added crop. And we can combine wild with edible and value-added. Right? There are species that are all of those things. So when we look at these things and say, let's take the wisdom and the thinking of understandings of things like the Nature Conservancy and use them to redesign how we farm and also to maybe position ourselves for funding streams from different venues for what we want to do on our farm as far as restoring native diversity in the places where it makes sense. Food sheds are another piece I wanted to talk about. And food sheds are kind of this up-and-coming term for defining where's the land area away from an urban epicenter that most of the food's going to come from. Now, one of the things we really want to start to think about when we design these types of regional food sheds is, can we design them to make sense in terms of these physiographic provinces I've been talking about? And what I'm seeing is that most of the studies simply use this kind of bullseye concept, where they're like 50 miles out or 100 miles out. And the problem with that is that you're not really asking, is this an appropriate way to be farming? What's the best way to farm? You're just sort of asking a logistical number. How many people live there? How many farms are there? How many of the existing farms, what do they produce per acre? And then you're projecting from that. This is both from a Columbia University study and from a Food NYC, from a Scott Stringer study. He's the borough president of Manhattan, looking into food security for New York City. And this is a study they did trying to analyze the potential for food production within a 100-mile radius of New York. And then this is a study that Columbia did, asking a similar question. This is a project that we did for a watershed group in West Virginia, giving farmers a suggestion for appropriate ways to log, farm, and build in terms of the geology of that watershed. It's the Greenbrier River watershed. And it's one of the cleanest watersheds in the eastern seaboard, and it has a lot of caving and karst geology. Karst is super high quality artesian drinking water. 25% of the world's drinking water actually comes from karst geologies. It's spelled K-A-R-S-T, and it's a really high quality limestone, but super porous. And so if you've got cattle pooping in a sinkhole, you've got a nitrogen problem immediately getting right into groundwater. Right? If you have a sewage treatment plant that releases water near a cave, which was happening in instances. So these are the kinds of things that I've done. We wrote a grant to the EPA to get this funded, and then we went around and created this information package so that people could see a cross-section of what the geology was like, understand how porous it was, but give recommendations, not just say no logging, or no farming, and this is the difference of the school of thought that I've been working in for the last 15 years in conservation, which is that it's not about telling people you can't do things. It's about saying, how do you do it in a way that meets what they're already doing in a way that's accessible? How do you make a redesign feasible? Understanding where you are. You know, watersheds are still a radical thing to have a sense of when you're looking at a landscape. Very few people still really bother with doing this homework on where they are. And it really defines where you are. Where is the nearest stream to where you're farming? And what is the name of it? And what does the DEP or the local regulatory agency say about the water quality of it? And how can you, as a steward of that waterway, actually improve it before it leaves your landscape? Right? So that what we're saying is, be a responsible steward. And be a responsible steward of rainfall that lands on your property. Catch, hold, store, and cycle it through as many living things as possible is how I like to word it. In permaculture, one of our principles is catch, hold, and store energy high in the system. And what we're saying is topographies catch, hold, and store energy. They catch, hold, and store rainfall. They catch, hold, and store silt and sediment loads. They catch, hold, and store solar income in the form of the vegetation that grows on them. And what we're looking at is we're looking at the whole landscape, whether it's a topographic landscape or whether it's a building in a city. And we're saying those are surfaces that we could be gardening from the top down. And when we look at these riparian zones, we're saying this, for instance, is exactly the wrong place for the cattle to be in this drawing. It's just ironic, because it happens to be just one of the best sort of caricature drawings of a watershed I can find, but it's sort of irony here is like the sort of like archetypal farm. No way, there's no riparian buffer zone there. So off the mark in terms of our cultural concept of what we consider bucolic and pastoral. Not bucolic and pastoral to have your cattle pooping, getting hoof and mastitis, and breaking their ankle on eroded stream banks. It's just not, right? So there's multiple reasons that I'm getting at for why not to do these things. So where are we in our watershed? Those are things to define who we are and what we're doing. Just a brief side note to say that the New York City water supply system is a great example of catch, hold, and store energy high. The reservoirs were placed at the highest point to get the best quality and the largest catchment so that they could get pressure pushing it over 4 stories high throughout the 5 boroughs area. So throughout New York City, if you're 5 stories or lower throughout many parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan and the grid goes down, you'll still have pressure and water at the tap. In fact, my apartment there, I'm in a 4-story apartment in Brooklyn, partially for that reason.
When did they design that? What decade?
The 1890s. And they built it and finished most of it around 1912 into 1920. The Delaware system was the earlier one, and then they realized it wasn't going to be enough capacity, probably because of chronic leaks and misuses and various things, and they quickly did the land grab for the Catskill one, which is why it has a little bit more of bad public opinion still in the Catskills about that water system. There's still bad blood over what happened there, because it was real quick. We're just going to take all your farms and flood them. And they weren't soft about it at all. So, and it's actually a bit of an interesting historical side note that there were laws then made in the country that municipalities couldn't go out of their own jurisdiction to do things with real estate, because people got nervous about what New York City did with being able to buy real estate outside of the city and protect it and make it so that it was good water for the reservoirs. Because what they also do is they actively buy up any private property that's adjacent to the reservoirs so that they can just let it go back in the forest. Because they know that the best way to have good quality in those lakes that are the reservoirs is to have forests all around the banks of it. So there, and if you live within the counties where those reservoirs are, your taxes are dropped significantly because you can't develop it at all. So New York City tied up what could be done with the land as well. So it's all under conservation easements. So kind of interesting to look at watersheds and think about where we are. Here's our Connecticut River watershed. And that's our main artery of the landscape. It ties us all together. It is the context of what happens on the surface of the land. In effect, water is like the mercurial, what goes around comes around. It's that element. I always say that as a designer, if you get one thing right in your design, and it'll make everything else work, it's water. If you pay comprehensive attention to water in your farm design, a lot of other things are going to really work out nicely if you forgot paying as much attention to vegetation and wildlife. Because we break landscapes into layers when we do a full ecological analysis. This is looking at how can we take existing areas that are wet and are swampy and have useful crops that are produced on them. So a swampy area will oftentimes grow things like red osier dogwood, shrub willows, blueberries. Right now, obviously blueberries. We could be doing a lot more high bush blueberry and mixing in cultivated varieties with native varieties. We can be using shrub willows to make baskets that we sell our produce at 14th Street Union Market for obscenely more money because it's in a handmade basket that then they get to take home, made from a coppicing willow lot. Coppicing just means you cut the willows and it grows back in 3 years, and you can cut it again in 3 years, and you can cut it again in 3 years. And people have been doing this for 500 and 800 years in Europe. And one of my colleagues, Mark Krawczyk, is writing a book right now about it called Agroforestry and Coppicing. Because we feel it's so important as part of the Northeast potential way to transition away from coal and oil and uranium as power sources, and in a sustainable way start to look more at woodies as a significant part of our energy regimen, but not in a way where we repeat the mistakes of the past where the eastern seaboard was just decimated to fuel things like steam locomotives in ways that were inherently unsustainable. Right? So we're trying to be strategic, and we're saying as we transition intelligently, wisely, and hopefully comfortably into a better quality of life, let's also move away from dependence on things that we know are inherently toxic, like using oil to heat our homes. And if we're going to suggest that people use wood, then we need to redesign how homes are so that they require less energy input in the first place, by making more oriented to the south, by insulating them with natural materials. We right now, in our consultation business, do a good bit of whole site design, but we've also done now a good bit of design build of straw bale homes and natural homes for clients after we've done a whole site design where we suggest where the home should go, what it should be made out of, then our crew of general contractors and carpenters come in and build a post and beam non-load bearing straw bale home, generally slab on grade with passive solar hot water going through the slab that is integrated with a wood stove. The wood stove also has a copper coil that goes into the slab. So that this way you've got a really well-designed home. And you can retrofit homes to do this, to use things like passive solar hot water arrays. In fact, passive solar hot water, arguably way more important than all this attention to active electric. Because hot water is something that, actually, if your electricity is out, which would you rather have? The ability to turn on a light or the ability to wash dishes in your hands and take a shower? And you'll find eminently that hot water is totally the thing that you want, that you don't care if the other creature comforts are out. In fact, most people are like, man, it was kind of cool when the electric was out. Kind of draggy came back on. Now we're using the lights again. We had candles on. It was kind of chill. Right? Mostly we enjoy it. And it's usually the thing that's a drag is that you can't wash dishes, you can't take a shower, you can't flush a toilet, right? All of a sudden, we can retrofit those systems to be much more elegantly, sustainably, low-tech and integrated, no problem. Rainwater tanks going to your flush toilet, hot water coming from passive solar arrays in your wood stove. Wood stoves are eminently a better way to heat just because they're so simple, and you can put a hot water bucket on the top of it instead of something like a wood gasification furnace or geothermal heat pumps. I'm not a fan of that stuff. I can't endorse it as a builder. To saddle my clients with something that's high-tech, fancy, takes 5 or 6 wells and call it eco. Nothing eco about that. That's an insane amount of inputs and energy that you did to create a system that only a few people can fix and charge an obscene amount. Does that seem like a good thing to saddle a client with? To me, that's irresponsible design. But a lot of people think that they're doing the right thing when they design something that's a passive house or these geothermal heat pump systems. Might make sense on an institutional scale in an urban environment. But if you're asking me for residential dwelling, it makes absolutely no sense. The scope and scale, the tech, and the cost make no sense. So permaculture is saying, you know, what types of houses make sense? What types, that all spiraled out from me talking about shrub willows, if you can believe that. Right? But it's fascinating because it all gets back to materials, which is what I'm really focusing on here, is I'm saying, how do we as farmers create materials that we can build buildings out of, that we can make baskets out of, that we could grow berries in a wetland and still be happy that it's a wetland and not tile drain it? Right? So it's this important shift that I'm wanting to show that we can make delicately, elegantly, and lucratively. Right? So a wet meadow will grow milkweed, meadow rue, meadowsweet, boneset, arrowwood, elderberry. Right? So we can make elderberry throat tincture. We can make all kinds of medicinal products out of boneset, out of milkweed. So all of a sudden, instead of looking at places as, oh, how can we change that and grow some corn there or raise some sheep? We're saying, well, okay, there's parts of this where we can grow corn. There are parts where we can raise sheep. But then there are parts that give you too much work. Just don't bother. And let's help out, actually, certain things that we could make a product out of. And let's sustainably harvest them and increase their population. And yeah, let's actively decrease some of the things that we can't use so much. But in that instance, we're still absolutely enhancing biodiversity because we've now turned something that's a wild plant into a cash crop. And that's a good idea. And we can create wildlife corridors so that how we're farming and what we're doing in our riparian zone makes sense in terms of thinking about what types of pollinators, what types of herbivores, what types of wild animals. Because what we're saying in permaculture is both what we're doing here needs to make sense and what we're doing here needs to make sense. And when we actually design what we're doing here to consider human beings and a harvest, that makes a lot more sense too. It's not just about ecology for ecology's sake, which is the thing that I differed with the restoration ecology movement with in the early 90s when I sort of shifted to the permaculture camp in terms of my personal philosophy around it. Restoration ecology is too much leaving human beings out. It's like, well, why would I want to return a landscape to some idealized notion that excludes people as part of it? And oftentimes I've been to Society of Ecological Restoration talks and events, and you'll find people there unapologetically kind of bust on human beings, as if people are just this scourge on the planet. It's just kind of funny to, are you crazy? Like that's a dysfunctional view of ourselves, to think that people are inherently detrimental to the planet. right? And to make it seem somehow like, oh, we're now informed because, oh, we just understand that we're a plague on the earth. What are you talking about? That is a flawed. That's as bad as original sin in my opinion. That's getting personal, but like, wow, are you kidding me? That is a flawed view of human beings, in my personal opinion, right? So I think that we see that underneath these things there are philosophical implications. And when we look at things like, how do we see ourselves as human beings? How do we see the act of agriculture? Can we actually see it as a restorative, renewing act that re-inhabits the earth, where we re-inhabit the places we call a home in a way that really has dignity and integrity for who we are as a species, where we have a deep sense of honor and appreciation and understanding of our inheritance from our ancestors, much of which is the cornucopia of abundance that they handed us in the form of the domesticated plants and animals, right? And to denigrate that is a mistake, which we also find in some of these well-intended ecological movements, to say, in effect, when agriculture happened, that was the downfall. And when humanity broke from this sort of pristine, mythical relationship with wilderness landscapes, which is also an utter misconception. Because hunter-gatherer societies had heavy-handed impacts on the landscapes where they lived, not always positive. And to make generalizations like that actually causes us to have a misconception about who we are and the viability of the mistakes that we're making. In other words, we get sort of extremist in a sort of categorical sense and say, well, clearly we're flawed and doomed as a species. Like, well, not necessarily. I'd rather bank on the exception to the rule than the rule right now. If the evidence shows that more often than not, human beings don't do things in a way that's sustainable, that still doesn't mean that it's not conceivable that we could learn how to do it. And I think it's important that we don't gloss it or try to make it seem like, oh yeah, of course, because it's the right thing, it's going to be easy. No, it doesn't work that way. Just like with doing a farm or an organic business, you realize, you don't just instantly do well because what you're doing is organic. And people have these misconceptions in this culture. It's the same hard 3 to 5 years of maybe barely starting to make it by 5 years where you really feel like, right, but that 3 years in, is this even going to work? I'm massively in debt still. How is this all going to pan out, right? That is just, and we need more of us to take that risk of saying, look, I'm not expecting the corporate sector to hand us on the shelves what we're looking for. I'm expecting us to stand up and be the producers. And part of how we do that is by bringing back in these wild ecologies and redesigning the cultivated ecologies. And then we can extend this, right? Then we might realize, well, maybe even this area is kind of wet and not super productive, and I could have let this riparian zone be 100 feet wider because I'm actually going to do a bunch of European chestnuts there and some hazelnuts and some hawthorns, and use the hawthorn to make a heart tincture out of the hawberry, as it's called, which is a highly valued medicinal crop, and also a food source for pollinator songbird, the vireo songbird. It's interesting to look at how can we start to continue to make the finances around land make sense for agriculture to make sense. Because what is important is to start to try to get agriculture out of the commodities market. And that's part of what the CSA structure did, was it started to have the buyer share the risk with the grower. And real estate is also something that has certain economic prohibitory elements to it. And it's expensive in the Northeast to try to farm. And so oftentimes one of the things that I've been suggesting that I think is really important is for farmer and gardeners to resource land trusts and conservation groups and connect with them for land and see if they have opportunities for you to do long-term leases on some of the land that they already have. Because many of these land trusts and conservation groups have, in many instances, tens of thousands of acres of real estate. And oftentimes, some of it's old farms. And they might be very open to a request for proposals process where you said, look, I want to do a beyond organic farm that increases biodiversity, and here's my plan for this property I know you have that I heard about through the grapevine. And I want to rent it to start this operation. Land trusts that are doing this are finding that all of a sudden their donor base gets a lot more interested in supporting them too. And that's some of the reason that some land trusts have started to realize we need to continue to be relevant to our donor base. And sometimes after the land's been protected, the people who are donating get less interested in the whole thing because they feel like the work is done. The land's been protected. But all of a sudden, if you have a community give back that you're doing, like helping a group start an organic or farm, then all of a sudden people think that, see what they're doing is important, see land trust is important. So these are two instances where a whole consortium got together and bought a farm and sold it for below market price through a request for proposal process. So Vermont Trust for Public Lands, Mad River Watershed Group, a whole bunch of other people in the area, like the Yestermar School where I teach up there, helped to buy this land. And then the collective had a request for proposal process and said, if you have these certain values and ethics, and if you're going to respect the riparian zone and allow us to put in a rail to trail and use this as agricultural use and do something socially responsible with it, then you should apply. So they gave a bunch of parameters, and a bunch of people applied. They sold it, they gave it to the Vermont Food Bank for well below market price. So the Vermont Food Bank was able to acquire a farm that they're growing super high quality nutritious food for a food bank that's fresh, instead of weird canned factory farm food, which is oftentimes what we'll see at food banks. Right? Actually having a working farm that is the producer for the food bank. They could have never afforded to have bought this farm in the Mad River, Water Valley, and Warren, Vermont. So it's an interesting example of I don't know how easy that would be to replicate, but what I'm getting at is that is a community that pulled together a consortium of people who cared about a certain piece of land, and they were able to do something really unique. And it's interesting to explore opportunities like that for yourself. There might be partnerships you could be creating in your area that could really give you the opportunity to have access to land, or to create different projects that you want to create, like a camp or an educational endeavor. This is about another one that they did, a lot of print. This is a farm, and folks talked about this here, Essex Family Farm. So Essex, I think, is a great example of moving more in the direction that we want to see. I love their description, year-round, full diet, free choice membership, produce grass-fed beef, pastured pork, chicken, eggs, 50 kinds of vegetables, milk, grains, flour, fruit, herbs, maple syrup, so quite a bit of stuff. 600 acres, 222 members. I like this mix of how they're powered. 9 draft horses, 10 full-time farmers, and 3 tractors. But now we're starting to look at regional food. Right? This is starting to be an example of we could have heritage breeds of draft animals, a whole integrated farm design, lots of opportunity in a high production farm to start to plant out the edge of your farm. Right? Your tree lines. This is where the permaculture tree crop stuff comes in, that oftentimes farms like this aren't necessarily thinking about. They also may not be thinking about water systems or infrastructure, which is the piece that we add. It's another mix where we're saying, can you gravity feed water from a barn so that interns can take a shower and have a sink of their own, rather than having to come into the 1800s farmhouse where everybody's packed in and getting tired of each other. And I see that a lot. Right? So I'm looking at that and saying, we've talked about this, bringing back in riparian zones. So designing, laying out where and how we put in crops, what our understory crops are. Looking at the whole site. Here's a design we did where we were wanting to show the client both where we wanted them to increase and extend the existing riparian zone, and then start to use silvopasture, which is a European technique of basically having value-added tree crops in the middle of a pasture in clusters so that they create shade for the livestock but don't diminish. In fact, we find actually improve cool season grass production. So cool season grasses, which are endemic to the whole Northeast, generally do better if they don't experience the full sun of the summer and get a little bit of dappled shade. So silvopasture is actually a pretty dialed-in set of species and techniques that we can kind of just transplant a lot of the assemblages from Northern Europe as far as the species varieties, and look at things like butternut and hickory that also offer deworming agents apparently for some of our livestock like sheep. So there are lots of ways we can integrate benefits and say, all right, could we plant tree crops that also help the pasture to do production, but also kind of mimic the native ecosystem that wanted to be here, which was forests. right? But still have grazing going on, and have it in a layout where we could also still bring in a machine and hay. And you know, some of this stuff might look like this as we get started, not necessarily pretty, but effective. Where we're saying, really, it's as simple as this part of what we're saying at a technique level, is tree crops with livestock, and all of a sudden you've got something that's a lot more like a wild ecosystem, and going to have some really interesting beneficial feedback loops that happen. And laying out your farm on contour to think about water and how it moves across the landscape. This is a farm that's in a semi-arid landscape where we're looking at tree belts that are purposefully planted wherever there's a significant drop-off in contour, simply to prevent erosion and create windbreaks. And these are places where, again, in permaculture, we're saying really pack and stack some interesting polyculture assemblage in here. Stuff that you could use for medicinals, nuts, things that, like the hawthorn, that can become a living fence and has a medicinal use. Generally, the most underutilized space on larger pasture farms is their fence line. And it's an opportunity to farm and garden the heck out of it with things that are tree crops that are appropriate for it, that may be shrubby varieties. And maybe you're primarily about habitat and cut flowers and Rosa rugosa to make medicinal crops out of, right? So we kind of start to mix it, get into these medicinal things, think about the whole landscape. This is the terraforming technique that a man named P.A. Yeoman came up with called keyline design, also part of permaculture. Is saying, think about your entire topographic layout and how many catchments can you put into it. We've even had, in some of the literature in permaculture, suggestions as high as 15% for the amount of your land area to have in water features. And you know, you really can't have enough different microcatchments. It also allows you to quality control those water sources. So that you're not trying to make one big pond low in the landscape, but then you're having to spend energy with pumps to get it back up in the landscape. But you're saying, how many little ponds can we make that fit topographically with the landscape? But especially important in semi-arid, but still important in the Northeast to realize a lot of farms that I look at are heavy well dependent and vastly underutilized rainwater. Ooh. It's just reminding me of something. Well, rainwater here in the Northeast, 45 inches annual rainfall. Very few months of less than 2 inches. Vastly underutilized resource that we can start to power a lot of our farm systems off of. And a lot of it's just about the size of your catchment. This is a design we did for a 57-acre property that was an abandoned cattle farm in outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And it's kind of to give you a sense of what we do with permaculture that is different in the diversity of elements that we're integrating on a site. So we're looking at things like, how do we house interns in structures that have outhouses and catchment areas for showers? How do we create places for community to gather? Ponds, fire circles, performance events, places for people to meditate and come to the land for things like healing and yoga and therapy activities of sorts. Places for people to have a sauna experience down near where there's a nice cold stream happening. Adapting more perennial crops like vineyards that are on a slope that gets dry, hot exposure and is appropriate for grapes. Taking steep slopes and converting them to tree crops that we can still have some grazing. Using the ridgeline for things like windmill and having some hydropower down here. Right, so looking at the whole, an interesting thing that we had to do in this design is that we had a power line going over that stream up there at the top, and so all of the plantings were all things like hazelnut, dogwood, witch hazel. They were all things that stayed mid-story and lower, so that they wouldn't interfere but would recreate a riparian zone, because there was none. It was just a stream flowing through the middle of the field that needed some vegetation. And breaking properties into usually the further away area is more like just leave it alone and enjoy it. Maybe create some retreat areas up there. But getting into farms is multifaceted, multifunctional diversity of events that are happening, dining events, hosting events, retreat. And where are people gonna, I think it's my connection cord, so. And where are people going to stay? Which is another big part of what we're creating are these 3-season natural buildings that then go to shared outdoor kitchens and shared in-turn bunkhouses, all of which are just 3-season, gravity-fed, off-the-grid rainwater supply. More of the technique, right? What does it look like as we start to go across the slope, design with contour, integrating tree crops, integrating livestock. This is Carl Hammer taking compost and food scraps out of the waste stream in Montpelier, Vermont. Carl has 1,200 chickens that he feeds nothing to, but the food scraps of Vermont that he makes a multi-million-dollar compost product out of called Vermont Compost. And those chickens lay 900 dozen eggs a month for him. And he feeds them absolutely no grain, and they're heritage breeds. So he can use these beautiful, heavy breeds like Australorps, because he's not in this reductionist paradigm that I understand that many beginning farmers are struggling with, which is grain to egg ratio. And when you get into this kind of reductionist paradigm, you end up with breeds that are actually the newfangled hybrids of the factory farm world, being what many beginner organic egg producers are doing, because they aren't actually doing something as creative and with potential mistakes to be had, for sure, and something as gregarious as saying, I'm not going to feed my chickens any grain, I'm going to start a compost operation, and I'm going to get the city of Montpelier to dump off all their food scraps, and that's all I'm going to feed the chickens. That's literally what Carl does. Nothing but food scraps, 900 dozen eggs a month. Oh yeah, totally.
What's his name?
Carl Hammer. And we've taken students to study with him for 4 years. We go at least twice a year and just kind of sit at his feet. He really should be the advisor to the EPA on what to do with compost in this country. Because a lot of what's happening with the attempts to get organics out of the waste stream is dubious, to say the least. And these operations, hearing a lot of stories about organic farms in California with shredded plastic bags all over the place because of the fact that they're doing such a mediocre job with municipal scale compost, because it's all about volume, too much about volume, not enough about quality. And what Carl is showing is really how you create a super high quality product and you quality control the waste stream of what comes into it. A lot of what he's doing is literally dumping out each load and picking through it. He's got 10 employees, fuels all of the machines off of 100% biodiesel, uses canola oil for the hydraulics. Probably the only thing you should use canola oil for. And he says mainly the reason he uses B100 in the canola is for worker health, so that they're not operating machines that have really toxic diesel fumes all day long. But you can see that the chickens are just running around, ton of wood chips, all of that so that he says, Carl has a great phrase, he says, we used the devil's tools and we left it cool for mules. And he's really, really an inspiration, a real teacher. And one of the things Carl's been looking at is Switzerland. And he says, you know, the Swiss have figured out how to close their borders and have food security for at least 3 years. So he's looked at the numbers on that and said, you know, what would it take for Americans to be food self-sufficient? What are the numbers? What percentage of our population? And Carl's estimate, just as a loose working number that's fun to kind of play with, 1 in 6. He's saying if 1 in 6 families really is a grower-producer family, the other 6 can be specialist technocrats and just buy stuff, right? And that's kind of interesting because, you know, that could be 100 and 600, 1,000 and 6,000, 10,000 and 60,000. That's conceivable. It's conceivable. And I think that to a degree I want to give that example because we are, in our mythology of what is the permaculture paragon, it is to a degree an agrarian democracy that has a larger producer economy instead of consumer economy. And that producer economy is displacing the petrochemical industrial sector with a more local biological production by the people and for the people. And what I'm saying is that's really the only way we're going to take back power and take back quality and integrity in the marketplace. Because if you expect big business, Fortune 500 corporations and the federal government to really do things in a way that has that level of quality, we don't really understand that the complexity of the designs that we're talking about here, the uniqueness of something like what Carl Hammer's doing, requires an artist, not just somebody who's a number cruncher and maxes out yields of one element per whatever, but is actually people who have a beautiful relationship with the place where they are that is complex and has a lot of elegance and finesse to it. And in order for something to have that, it has to have human participation. And we're going to need more people to be enjoying this experience of interacting daily with plants and animals and wild landscapes, so that we can displace this tendency we have to rely upon things that are extracted, mined, and refined products.
How long have you been doing that?
Carl's been up there for at least 30 years.
Oh my God.
And he started out gathering the food scraps with mules and a horse-drawn cart going through the city of
I'm
Montpelier.
surprised he hasn't disappeared.
He's managed to deal with Act 250, he's managed to deal with all kinds of things, and now people are finally starting to recognize him for the real gem that he is. But as I said, truly, I think that he is the person who, if people are saying, so could you tell me who should be the head of the EPA compost operation? If anybody asks you that, Carl Hammer. Absolutely. Carl's #1 choice of who should be thinking. I've been doing numbers
Carl
on...
with a C or a K?
K. K-A-R-L. Carl
Can
Hammer.
I get that number again? You said 1 out of 6
So he says 1 in
families?
6. He says 1 in 6 families.
So
So
if
one
we say a
family...
family is 4,
Yeah.
then we
3
can
to
break
5
that
people.
down by the national per capita.
Yeah. And again, just a loose working number
Yeah.
based on, and the Swiss actually...
What's the 45 million for our families?
Awesome, thank you. That's
They have
great.
to be-
I like that.
Be directly involved with producing more than they eat themselves.
Right, exactly. And he's basing that on saying that Switzerland actually, from what I understand, subsidizes small farmers to be producers so that they have that number. So they just say, well, look, we may not need you right now, but in case we do, keep doing what you're doing. Here's some. So instead, who do we subsidize in this country? We subsidize the timber industry. We subsidize factory farm cattle industry. We subsidize coal, nukes, all these things that should just be allowed to collapse, right? So the EPA estimates 41 million tons. They're saying if we look nationally, we said how much of the waste stream that could be composted ends up in landfills. 41 million tons. They're saying that 60% of average waste streams in the United States is what their term is source separable organics. New York City, where I teach and have done a lot of numbers on this, 3,160 tons a day of what gets trucked out in New York is source separable organics. So that's a huge energy loss. It's jobs in Calcutta. 22,000 people are employed just processing compost. And that's going to be a lot more fun than picking up stinky, dripping, weird bags of rat-infested trash where you mix your food with it. It's an inherent hygiene problem to be doing that. And it's like you'll solve a rat and disease problem in urban epicenters by getting food out of the trash, without a doubt. You totally will. And you can do in-ground anaerobic digesters where you can take meat and dairy and on everything. And you could be producing gas that people are using to cook with at their stove. In one of the brownfields in New York City, 4,000 acres of land on 6,000 parcels is deemed undevelopable. But if you want to pour a concrete slab on it and build a biogas generator to power some of the homes in the neighborhood, you'd be allowed to do that. So interesting ideas that we're looking at as to how do we retrofit? Where do we retrofit? Ultimately, the term here that I'm speaking to is decentralization. How do we decentralize the infrastructure and regionalize it so that we're not utterly dependent upon a hyper-extended long-distance transportation, global import-export economy to have food on the table, or to have lights on, or to have clothes on our backs, and all of a sudden we're much more in relationship to a regional network of producers who create the food on our tables, the clothes on our back, and generate the lights at night so we can be reading the material that continues to inform and excite us about designing our farm in the wintertime, in the long, cold winter of the Northeast. Because I lived off the grid for 8 years in West Virginia, and for the first 5 years I had no solar panels and no lights and did everything with just candles and lamps. Partially because I kind of wanted to learn. I call it my own permaculture PhD project, because it was in 1999 to about 2008 that I was doing that experiment in creating a naturally built off-the-grid straw bale house and launching my consultation business by working primarily for Gesundheit down there, which is a 325-acre property where Patch Adams wants to build a free hospital. So I've kind of been doing a lot of different things to kind of get a sense of what do we need and what don't we need. Definitely I think lights at night in the Northeast is something that we need. I'm going to say that. And lights are interesting technology. But if you ask yourself, what's the biggest energy hog that you can start to get off of, it's your 220 well pump. right? And the 220 well pump is why you want to diversify your water systems and get your interns off of the 220 well pump and get your farm off of the 220 well pump. And don't think hooking solar panels up to it means it's now green, because it's not. A lot of toxic things were created when they made those solar panels. So if you can just catch it, hold it, and store it in a big pond or in a big tank off of your barn and use that, you'll find that with 2 to 4 inches every month, you can supply a lot of water. So integrating tree crops, this is just showing a thing from ATRA, right? ATRA was the appropriate technology transfer to rural areas, something like that. But a lot of good pamphlets on that. And this is from their agroforestry thing. This is silvopasture. So you get a sense of what that looks like, where you have the dappled light. I have 15 more minutes, right? This is a biodynamic farm in Pennsylvania where I studied. It's the Kimberton Hills Campfield Village. And I was taking my high school students there because I taught at a free school called Alpatinas. It's actually just closed this year after 41 years. And I would take my high school kids to volunteer here because after I studied permaculture, I realized that here's the way I like to generalize and characterize about it. Forest gardens will get you nice, funky little fruits that are good for jelly, jam, and wine. But if you want a really good-looking keeper fruit that stores in your root cellar from October to April, biodynamics is probably going to be one of the disciplines you're going to want to check out if you don't want to use any chemicals and you're willing to do a fair amount of physical labor. So there's a lot, and I'd say there's no substitute for attention to detail. And that's absolutely, in my lay opinion, without spending a lot of time on going into BD and biodynamics, part of why it works is the level of attention to detail. You pay that close attention to what's going on with the heavens and the stars and the lunar cycles, no doubt about it, you're tuned into things that are happening on your farm and in your landscape that are subtleties that you might not notice if you don't start to kind of practice a discipline. And then you can not practice it, right? It's like many disciplines. You start to do route memorization and then you don't have to look at the written music anymore. And biodynamics is very much like that. It's something where initially it kind of feels like, wow, this is crazy complex with a lot of arcane concepts. But it's actually, to me, it's like it's the way in which the modern culture kept alive the pagan old world alchemical tradition, right? So the pagan old world alchemical tradition is basically a way to describe what biodynamics is. So it's very combining different things, and it works very simply with earth, air, water, and soil, which is what I like. I feel like those are very practical, knowable things. You can contact earth, you can touch it, you know what air feels like when you're breathing it. But have we ever seen a nitrogen molecule? Maybe, I don't know, I haven't. Have you ever seen phosphorus, right? So it's kind of interesting to get back into these more just fundamental ways of talking about plants and animals and the earth and how does it work. So I find a lot of resonance between biodynamics and permaculture because permaculture as a gardening technique comes from a more tropical climate. And in the tropics, the way we build diversity is plant, plant, plant. In the temperate climate, the way we build diversity is build soil, build soil, build soil. And that's because in the temperate climate, the vegetation goes dormant, and there's actually way more biodiversity banked in the soil than there is above ground. If you look at the tropical landscape, you'll see all the biodiversity is in the top growth. It's not in the soil. The soil is very, very thin and has very little ability to regenerate when it's been clear-cut because of that. Whereas in the temperate landscape, it forgives our folly of these extreme clear-cutting habits because we have a deep soil profile from which things can regenerate. And in the eastern seaboard, we have a particularly deep soil profile because we're in the foothills of the oldest mountain range on the face of the planet, which is the Appalachian Mountain Range at over 450 million years old. So we want to contextualize where we are, right? So we're biodynamic farming, Campfield Village, biodynamic techniques, partially because we're in the Northeast. The Northeast is more of a climate analog to Germany and Europe, where BD comes from. Permaculture hailing primarily from Australia and tropical climes. So technique-wise, design-wise, permaculture, way more expansive and comprehensive. It's saying, let's design your whole farm, let's design your whole infrastructure, let's think about waste systems, integrating it, let's think about your economics. Biodynamics is a little bit more focused on farm design It's about farming, but it's not necessarily so much about infrastructure and economy. So there's a really rich synergy when you start to combine these things. I was taking my high school students there to volunteer, and part of what they're doing in the orchard is they're rotationally grazing raw milk dairy herd, then they're rotationally grazing sheep, and then they're moving chickens through it. So it's you're starting to integrate. The biodynamic tree paste, the single most significant thing I saw that they were doing that I felt made an important difference in the health and quality of the trees. What it is you're literally scraping and pasting each tree, just lightly scraping it to give it what I call a dermatological scrub, and then pasting it. And it gets rid of the places where mold, blight, fungus, and insect cocoons reside. And you're combining clay, cow manure, and water. And if you're getting into the biodynamic methods, you're probably going to use some of the preparations as well, but not absolutely essential. Primarily what's doing the action here is clay, cow manure, and water, because the cow manure and the clay have this nice interrelationship where the fibers in the manure help to make it so the clay doesn't crack. And then the clay is what it is that's creating this great wicking effect of making the tree actually drier. And so it really cuts down on the problems you'll see with fungus, blight, mold, and insect damage. If you're doing it, this is the latest you would ever want to do it. Generally, you're trying to do it more like February, right after your pruning. This is that same orchard after we built a sheep shed that has rainwater catchment off of it, the highest point in the property, with heritage-breed sheep under a black locust. Right? I know it's a devil plant in this landscape, but I would suggest it's actually, maybe if I had to hold one up and say this might be part of our salvation, black locust would definitely be on the list. Pretty exciting tree, right? Pseudoacacia robinia. It is a nitrogen fixer. It has incredible blossoms that bees love, and one of the highest BTU woods in the country. And you can cut it, and it grows quickly, and you can cut it again, and it grows quickly again. You can stick it in the post to make a fence, and it won't rot for 60 years. You can build a barn out of it, and it won't rot for 40 to 60 years for the post of your barn. It's an incredible wood. I build with it all the time. I built my whole straw bale house out of it. Incredible wood.
Is it hard to cut?
Sure, but not as hard as Osage orange, which is a ridiculous wood, but the highest BTU wood in the country. The one that gets where it's called like those, I call them monkey brains, those green fruits that fall off of them. It's not so hard to cut. Girdling it is an easy way too to be dead standing. This is starting to show fruit trees and perennial flower crops, which is more what fruit trees like, and then things that attract in beneficial pollinators. So this is dill with fava beans, with a bunch of native wildflowers, and cabbages, right? So these are all attracting different insects, wasps and pollinators, and creating a whole little habitat that's beneficial. In fact, USDA did research on this at a facility they call the Appalachian Fruit Research Center. And they, in their studies, showed that if you plant white clover, yellow clover, buckwheat, and oats, and an array of other understory crops, other than grass, you'll see a decrease in disease problems and pest problems, and an increase in the yield and the health of the fruit. So at their own research facility, they're saying if you just plant a multitude of nitrogen fixers and flowers underneath your fruit trees, you're going to see a measurable benefit to your fruit trees. Just showing a little bit of design properties. This was one that, when we have a wet area that we were saying, take the livestock out of the wet area, fence them off from it, turn it into a pond, plant it out with pawpaws and elderberries, cut down all these white pines that are taking over your pasture, and mill them up and turn them into a shed that you put a rain tech off of for your livestock. So oftentimes helping people who come onto sites kind of know what I jokingly say is not all trees are created equal. Right? So sometimes I'm helping people because I understand forest species and plant species enough that I can walk onto properties and say, those are weed trees that just grew there in the last 30 years. And while I'm a big fan of these forest gardens, I also am a big fan of fields in the northeastern meadows because I again recognize I have this appreciation for our ancestors and their sweat equity that went into creating these meadows and these fields. So I'm not quick to say, oh, just let a meadow or a field turn back into a forest. Maybe if it's wet and it shouldn't have been a field in the first place, but very often I'm suggesting that people reclaim fields and stay out of them in terms of where they maybe build a house. That they actually chunk into some young woods that are near to a field rather than sticking structures out in fields. That makes no design sense to me either. Because the field is the place you want to be doing cultivation and raising things that could be part of your well-being. In the urban landscape, using the vertical. Designing to detail. Here's a summer kitchen, cob ovens, the summer kitchen side view, gray water planting, so as people are using the sink in the summer kitchen. Over here, it's going out to elderberries and sweet flag iris, so you can sell cut flowers and you can make an added value product out of the elderberry. It's all coming off of a rain tank that's connected to the building. These are the kinds of things we're suggesting as we're saying at a farm. You're going to want to think about where your wood comes from, what you're building out of, how can you move your animals around, different ways to rotationally graze. This is an American milking devon who's tethered, who is grazing right up to the edge of a chicken tractor. Fun for all ages. Here's the summer kitchen that we're building. Great things to just explore because we can, we teach classes out here, interns stay out here, we can host dining events out here. All things I recommend for part of the new farming economy is get diversified, get entrepreneurial, and market yourself for different retail events that you can do on site and undercut a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. Use rain tanks. Can't say enough about this. We just are doing a design for a client with a 40-acre property. She wanted to get onto her land. We built her a tent platform, an outhouse with a 500-gallon tank off of it, which gravity feeds to a shower and a kitchenette, so that she can be on her land, and the whole thing is working beautifully, and she's taking showers and cooking food on a little 2-burner propane stove. That kind of stuff we should be doing more of on our farm so that you can increase your hosting capacity. So that you have interns who have a real place to stay that they enjoy, and it gives them a little privacy. And that way you've got also something that you can advertise as an ecological kind of camp, because it's off-grid, gravity-fed rainwater supply. This rainwater tank is also irrigating our crops out here. Here's another form of a chicken tractor. Just a great way to really focus and concentrate the animal's behavior. So we're saying in permaculture, animals are our power tools is one of the sayings, meaning like instead of a tractor, I can have these birds do a certain amount of concentrated effort that does a similar kind of prep work for me. This is the bed they were just on. So this is how they leave it, which is then I usually go over with a hand tool and maybe rake it, and then I can plant right out in it. Thinking again about our bioregions or our ecoregions, here we got faint states of lines. Faint state lines, so you can see here's Massachusetts. It's looking at these physiographic provinces again. So we're back to our theme of how do we redesign agriculture to actually be regionally appropriate. I'm saying, well, the types of plants, the types of animals that we grow and farm in the lower New England, northern Piedmont will be different than the types of plants and the types of animals that really thrive in the high Allegheny Plateau. And so literally starting to adapt the assemblage of 4,000 plants, 152 species of animals that have been domesticated all around the world, and saying which ones might do well here, which ones might do well here, which ones might do well here. And then starting up little microcosms where we give it a try, and we start to try out different assemblages that we're adding on the edges of your already cash cow annual vegetable crops, right? So not trying to displace what we're doing that clearly makes near-term economic sense, but then ramping up the niche market value-added stuff that you're doing and your hosting capacity. Because what I see is really essential for the regional food movement is to be able to host the people who make the real sweat work possible to make it viable in a way that has real dignity and health and is enjoyable. And now we're starting to talk about something that's a real culture that people will continue to want to participate in and that will thrive. Reasonable sized tractors, large sheds with large tanks off of them, outhouses with water incorporated, simple bucket systems with compost, another rain tank off of high in the land, gravity fed to a shower. Here's a ram pump. Ram pumps are a passive pump that uses water pressure to push water uphill. It can push water uphill about 60 to 90 feet from where it starts. And it simply uses the water to lift a valve, and then the pressure is released and the valve drops back down, pressure builds up, valve lifts up, and it's doing this fairly rapidly. and that action of this valve lifting up and going down pumps the water 60 to 90 feet in elevation uphill and can be used to fill a pond.
RAM?
RAM, R-A-M, hydro RAM. Been around since the 1700s, entirely passive. The other 87% of the water just dumps back out into the stream right there. The 13% is getting pushed uphill. Or DC solar direct, right? So solar pumps. Then gravity feeding it with a pipe through the dam for irrigation. Large tanks. This was enough water that I didn't need the spring line to flow all winter long. So we sized these tanks big enough that all winter the water came from these tanks through a buried line into the main house, but the over 1,000-foot spring line running above the ground was frozen solid, and we didn't need it to flow because we had enough water stored in both those tanks for 3 months. So water, gravity-fed water, people might say, is that reliable? All you have to do is scale up your storage. That's it. If you're asking, like, well, how do we actually calculate for it? Do numbers. Start to say, well, how many animals are we giving water to? How much do they drink a day? And then figure it out. And here's another thing to remember. It doesn't have to do 100% to be worthwhile. It could do 5%. 5% is better than no percent of your water systems now coming from something that's gravity-fed and off the grid and is using springs, right? So don't get into that. Don't hamstring yourself with eco-idealism. If I can't do everything with rainwater, then why would I do anything? Because it's good that you can just do a little bit. Because you'll find like you could do a little cabin for your interns off of rainwater, but maybe you can't irrigate your livestock with it, because maybe your scale of head of cattle is too many for a rain system. But maybe it could provide water for an outer paddock that you have from a shed when they're out there, right? So think about it creatively, and always when you build a shed, when you think it's about structure, think about rainwater catchment and use metal, for sure. Absolutely, is important. Think about showers, think about the size of your tank. These are big tanks. Decks, springs, more springs. I'm a big fan of springs for drinking water, springs for gravity-fed systems, like awesome, vital water just coming out of the earth that very often people don't even know that they have on their properties. Vastly underutilized springs and rainwater. British Berkey, the Berkey filter is awesome because you can have completely unpotable water and turn it into really awesome tasting, good drinking water with a simple ceramic colloidal silver filter. Classrooms, teaching spaces, all off the grid, all no permits, all considered impermanent buildings, all made with rough cut local lumber. Here's the whole little infrastructure. Wood-fired hot water heaters, passive solar hot water heaters, so people can take, I say that really permaculture is about taking a long hot shower on a rock in the middle of the woods from a gravity-fed rain tank and enjoying it. So, thanks, folks.
Hemp in the building today?
Right now, cost prohibitive, very hard to find. Single contractor out of Canada will charge you top dollar to do it. Not seeing it right at the moment as very accessible on the U.S. market. A lot of interest is starting to happen. I just had a client who wanted to have a structure she was building be done with hempcrete, and the contractor quoted her at about $30,000 to do a wall system for a 600 square foot building, which was absurd. It was over half the budget that she had for the building, and so we went with straw bale, because we were able to do that for more like around $5,000 for the walling. So hempcrete, right now, I think it's getting, there must be something happening in a media stream, because a good number of people have been asking me about it. But my personal experience of it has been that, where I'm just like, if you get down to the details of it, you say who's doing it and what does it cost, it's right now getting some press, but the viability of it is a stretch.
Or kind of
There's a learning curve.
legislation or something that's going to make it viable for growing here. So that
To grow
will
hemp.
increase the supply.
Sure.
There's something going on there.
Yeah.
Exactly what it was. So if we do that, then the opportunities here.
But a lot of people are asking about, say, new materials. I'm not that interested in a lot of new materials. I think actually there's a lot of traditional, tried and true natural materials like local lumber, like rock, like sand, like clay, that I'm much more interested in and using as a builder because they're natural, they're local, and I support a local sawmill when I build out of wood. They came from right where I am. And why does, you know, so if I wanted to have, like, say, the post of a deck on something, it's going to be a rock. And I'm going to dig down below frost line, fill it up with gravel to grade, put a nice rock on it, and then put the post of the deck on that. But what I see everybody does is they get, like, concrete, and they get this. I'm like, well, just because you can go to Home Depot and get it doesn't mean it's a good product. Right? Whereas if I can wander out in the woods and get it, it means it's an inherently more ecological choice. Inherently. And we're kind of like out of touch with this really simple logic where people are like, but ice rock is better than real rock because it's made out of recycled glass. No, it's not. No, it's not. Because it's made out of recycled glass from Utah, and it was toxic in the recycling process. They probably did that in the Philippines. So if you actually look at recycling, you'll see recycling is actually a bit of a shibboleth for continued destruction, as we say in design. Right? It's a bit of this foil. Oh, we're recycling. No, but why is everything that's recycled exported to be recycled? Because recycling is so toxic that nobody can do it in this country in compliance with the rudimentary environmental laws we have. So they go overseas and do this very toxic thing and then ship it back to us and say, cool, it's Trex. Your Omega Institute, build your whole deck out of this gross, monstrous hybrid stuff that I can't stand as a builder, where you combine sawdust with glue and call it an eco product and sell it to people. Look at how long it's going to last. You know, long lasting is not the only question that we want to have an answer to from a product. You know, perhaps short lasting and rotting, but being natural isn't always such a bad thing. You know, like, why is everything have to last forever? We've got, like, pressure-treated lumber is another monstrous hybrid, right? And we build children's playgrounds out of it. So, you know, so there's kind of these comforts that Americans have as a consumer society with very synthetic materials, and they don't have the critical thinking skills to have what some thinkers call the BS monitor, to say that's BS. There's no argument that can tell me that ice rock is better than natural rock if it has to come from glass from Utah that's recycled in the Philippines in order to make something that they call rock in Brooklyn that they make, and now it's called an eco product. I could have just gotten rock from the Hudson Valley, and people were actually, I just talked to a mason after my talk yesterday down in Holyoke, who was saying he's a rock mason, and he has people actually freak out on him because they're saying, that's such a horrific activity that you're involved in because of quarrying. Like, okay, sort of, maybe see that, but fracking I agree is a horrific activity, but a stone quarry, that's a lot more reasonable of a human way to be getting material than like hydrofrack, right? So people kind of have this lack of ability to kind of have a discretionary intelligence where they're like, well, of course, a material like rock is a more ecological choice than a material that had to be processed from all over the world and then brought to a place. There's no way that it's not a better choice. So when it comes to building materials, I always lean towards the carpentry axiom, which is KISS, right? Keep it simple. And that is important when it comes to what makes a truly ecological house. A house that was made from stuff that I could find within a reasonable distance of where it is inherently more ecological than a house that's made from high-end products that were branded and came from Germany. But it passes the blower test. Who cares about living in something that passes a blower test? I want a human-friendly home. I don't want some, like, technology to be what defines good living. It doesn't. So these are interesting ways I just want to share with you how I try to look at materials and material choices, and how as a builder, why we're now getting a lot of clients who want us to do naturally built straw bale homes. Because there's really nobody else doing it. Yeah, other questions?
Well, it wasn't really, well, it is a question. I know he had a rather odd architecture. You probably read it to Micro.
Oh, sure, the Earthship, yeah.
What do you think of it?
Well, I often joke and I say permaculture is not chicken tractors, herb spirals, and Earthships. Because a lot of people it can be, here's the way I like to put it, can be a skateboard park on the Lower East Side that has zero stormwater discharge. Because now you've got kids who were being busted by the cops for hanging out on the street, having somewhere to do something cool and physical and interactive, and the stormwater is being held and infiltrated on site. That's good design. Right? It's important not to think that permaculture is about growing nut trees. We're in the middle of the Lower East Side, and there's a bunch of kids who are always being harassed by cops, but we're going to plant a forest garden here. Like, that's not relevant design. and probably nobody will really use it. It'll be abandoned in 5 years. So get over your sort of like idealistic preconceptions where you think it's always about edibles. Very often it's not actually. It's actually about first providing human beings with somewhere to be outside and be together that's not technologically mediated, right? Unmediated environments. And that's why I'm such a big fan of these things like outdoor showers and decks. They're really a way for us to like entice a population that's got comfortable with environments like this, these hermetically sealed toxic boxes with pumped in and blown in air, to get them outside more and say you can be outside and you can take a shower and you can have hot water and you can sleep on a tent platform and not get bitten by insects. And all of a sudden you'll realize, wow, being alive on this planet is a pretty groovy thing, maybe. That's sort of the carrot at the end of the stick that we're going for. So we're saying, the first gateway drug that kind of got people into these life experiences was real food and wanting to be part of it. And so a lot of people are volunteering on these farms. I often have said, as a bit of a generalization, but fairly true, the regional farm movement is being powered by the sweat equity of a lot of privileged class college kids. And if you ask yourself, how long are those privileged class college kids going to find something exciting that they feel beat up, underpaid, underappreciated for? It's not going to roll for a long time. They're going to go a different direction. And that points to what permaculture is saying, not to be blowing their horn, but it's saying we need to redesign how we farm. We need to redesign infrastructures on farms to be low-tech, to be integrated, to be passive, to be off the grid for a lot of reasons. It's eco-savvy, it feels better, it's fun, it's easier to maintain, it's low cost. You can do it yourself, you can fix it yourself. These are all the reasons why we're into low-tech, keep it simple, keep it natural, and increase your hosting capacity of the labor force, because to do really, truly ecologically beautiful and complex farming, you need a lot of human beings participating in the work on that farm. Right? And what we'll see if we look at the most highly productive landscapes, we'll see there are things like rice farms that have ducks and fish in the aquaculture rice paddy. And if you think like, could you bring a tractor into a rice paddy that has ducks and fish in it? Of course not, right? So if we just look and kind of empirically say, well, if the highest production agroecosystems on the planet involve no power tools or machines and are entirely people-powered and hand-tooled, then that means in the G20 wealthy nations, if we want to really become sustainable, we need to move towards more people-powered, hand-tooled agriculture. And how we do that with a population who's stigmatized labor is by making it a beautiful, hygienic work environment, by being able to take a shower real quickly from a rain catch in the middle of the day when you happen to not have gotten up early enough to be doing your weeding. So I love, because you find as a farmer, gardener, builder, having somewhere to just stick your head under a faucet or wash your hands or do something is awesome. You can't have enough of them on a site. Oh, cool, I'm so glad I put that tap over there off of that other rain tank, off of that other shed. When you come to our site, we're doing one in Ellenville. I should mention I have a permaculture design course coming up. I'd love to hand flyers out about, and for our contact info. We're doing a gravity-fed water systems class this weekend coming up in Ellenville. So we'll do one where we'll be hooking up a rain tank from our house to an outdoor shower and to a sink. Just a one-day workshop there. But we teach a lot. This one that's going around is about a design certification course that really trains you to be a consultant, how to integrate it into your career choices, how to really use permaculture as a thinking tool for your property, for where you want to go in your life, for business ventures.
You travel. You travel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty much all in the Northeast. Any other questions, comments? Awesome. Yeah.
What about taking all the waste stream like cardboard, that kind of thing, for cleaning land that might be fallow and regenerating? Have you done that at all? Should we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Lisa DePiano with Montview CSA here in Northampton did a whole project. She has a really awesome business called Pedal People that she's one of the worker co-op owners of. And Pedal People was connected to Montview CSA. So Pedal People would pick up trash, pick up cardboard, pick up compost, and then they built a whole CSA on conservation land that the town owned in Northampton. Things went a little bit funny and weird over the last couple of years, and they're not there anymore.
Oh.
But a very successful program as far as the technique. Totally worked, and they had incredible production in a short amount of time with it.
Wow.
I know people were complaining about quarrying rock out of quarries. Is there a problem permaculture-wise with pulling rocks out of your field and using them?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. And that's a big part of what we're saying is that, you know, there's a lot of natural materials that are around that we should be using to build things where we are. And rocks in your field, especially, you know, we'll see all the colonists who are moving them in and making stone walls.
Like building the field while you're building the house.
Yeah. Yeah, and in southeastern PA, where I grew up in, outside of Philadelphia, there's a lot of field stone houses.
What would you recommend as, or do you have any recommendations for resources for some like aspiring permaculturists who don't necessarily have the capital to like retain someone like your services or something like that? Like
Or
how
to
to
take a
get
PDC. I'd say
to
taking
get expertise.
Taking the PDC is the easiest way because there's a lot of material in the permaculture design certification course. Ours is, I will say, on the lowest priced one that you'll find in the Northeast, and we do payment plans on it. So financially accessible for sure, but in Brooklyn. So it may not be geographic to you. The other thing I would say as far as materials is this book is great. The Introduction to Permaculture, Bill Mullison's book, absolutely a really good inroads as far as like a resource that you might find to be a good learning tool to get a little bit deeper into it.
Is there a minimum amount of acreage for someone to be having?
No. You know, it's,
everything you're doing is what?
well, I'm showing expansive ones because we're more at a
Yes.
ag conference, but I teach a lot in the city about suburban rooftop backyard gardening and farming. It totally applies at all scales. Because it's really just a design process where you're looking at your property and you're saying, where does the sun rise and set, where's slope, where are the wet areas, and what are my goals? Do I just want to have butterflies to look at, or do I want to have apples and cherries and lettuce? And so it's a nice discipline because it's saying, take what your desires are, take what your goals are, and spend time in your landscape, and then create a plan, where your plan is laying out your landscape to meet what your goals are. And it's done in a way that makes sense in terms of where the sun rises and sets, where the slope is. So you do an ecological assessment. And that's really what makes it permaculture. It doesn't at all. We have our students who design for their apartment. So they're thinking about the balcony and their window and their bathroom and their closets, and they're doing worm permaculture in closets and buckets. And yeah, you can really utilize it as a design process in any landscape. And then it can scale up to where we have students who design for a whole city block in Brooklyn, or design for a whole section of the Mad River watershed when we're up in Vermont. And that's really what we're excited about as teachers, is teaching you how to scale it up and scale it down. How to be able to take it as a process that applies anywhere. And then all of our students to graduate do individual presentations, so you'll see 20-some different examples of how it's applied, which very few other teachers do that. Most, they do group design. So you wouldn't see as much diversity as far as how do you apply permaculture to an eco-village in Brazil that's on 300 acres, to the Philippines in a ghetto slum situation where they're trying to address water quality, to a rooftop garden in Manhattan. So the students' designs are all over the world and all over the map in terms of the scale too, which is what we're excited about, and why I've been teaching in New York City for the last 7 years, is because of the diversity and the demographic of who I am able to attract there as students.
Permaculture is kind of a holistic way of looking at all this, just as holistic human health is.
It
it's
is.
away from
Yeah.
allopathic. It's
Yeah.
looking at all systems working well together.
Yeah,
That's what permaculture is.
yeah, and then just starting where you can
Yeah.
with what's accessible to you and here and now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? I don't know, are we all right time-wise? I'm just trying to be respectful. Cool. Let's go with other questions. What we got?
Well, I have a question about, I own 10 acres of a not too steep, but fairly steep, rocky type 7 soil that's mostly white pine right now. It's very wet.
What's the orientation?
Huh?
What's the orientation?
It's southwest.
Okay, that's nice.
And I'm just wondering, what are some of the kinds of appropriate uses for that? I'm also thinking about like the carbon storage aspect of it. So some people have said, conifers are sort of late succession trees, and maybe just leave it if you're thinking of carbon. But I also know that it grows great berries. Just cut down a tree and you got berries. But I'm just wondering, what are, in terms of your, like the permaculture model, what would someone think about doing on a piece of land like that if we were going to try to do something interesting?
Well, it's like I was just saying, really it's driven by what your goals are.
Yeah.
So there isn't some sort of like, oh, if I had this, I would do that, because it's a little bit more site-specific and individually based.
But I guess in terms of appropriate use, like...
Are you living there? Is your house already there? Is there a building on it?
Right now, other people are living there, but they're interested in doing a permaculture project living there, so...
Well, so the first thing they should do is do a good analysis and assessment of the site and create a map of the site and use a deed map, use Bing maps, other mapping facilities like that to get a good aerial image of it and get a good map, and then walk around the property and then start to mark on the map what they observe. So where do they see wet areas, where do they see, kind of get to know it and ecologically map it, and then start to think about and meet with you and talk about what are the kinds of things they'd like to do there, what are their design goals, what kinds of crops do they want to grow, where would be appropriate after they've done their analysis. So that's generally the process that we're recommending to do permaculture, is to say, well, first figure out what's going on ecologically with the place where you are. And that means looking at what's going on with topography, what's going on with plant and animal communities, generally what's going on with soil profiles that you can just observe, and kind of mapping all that stuff loosely at a concept level, not like it has to be super to scale. And then that creates a context that then you can start to discuss, well, where does it make sense to maybe do some fruit trees? And where should we maybe remove some of those pines and expand the ability for a greenhouse or vegetable production? Or maybe even an additional cabin on the site to be able to continue to host more people here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to be here for most of your workshop, so you may have already covered this, or it may not fit into what you're doing at all, but I've been looking for people who had some experience or opinions or knowledge about combining masonry heaters for heating of a space with also heating water and being able to provide piped water.
Well, the short answer is I know plenty of people who've done it. I haven't installed one myself, but absolutely being done.
I'd love a contact to somebody, because
Have you contacted people who install masonry stoves?
I haven't known somebody in my area to contact yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know that there is anybody in your area, but what I'm saying is that anybody who installs them, where I know there are people, it's not geographic to here. It's usually people are, there's installers in Vermont, there's installers in the Hudson Valley. There probably are some in this area because there's probably a market for it for some percentage of the population.
I'm in New Hampshire, and I'm kind of in a dead zone. So I've heard there are ones in Massachusetts, and I've heard there are ones in Vermont.
So here's my question.
I heard there's somebody in Maine.
Probably. What is masonry? What you're sure is the thing that you need? Because they can be pretty. They can cost a fair amount and be a little bit more. They might be more than you need. You might be able to accomplish what you're trying to do with a wood stove.
I have wood stoves, and it may end up not being what I need, but from the research I've done so far, it looks like a good idea.
Yeah.
There are some reasons why my space might not be perfect for it, but then I'd have to get into the details, which, if it's interesting to people, I'll talk for a few hours. But I can say, yeah, I'd be heating a big space. I've been in 2 homes in the area I live in where masonry heaters had been put in 30 years ago, and there was a 5,000 square foot that was built around a central chimney, and we live way north of here, and it was completely heated only by the masonry heater. They burned once a day except for 4 weeks at the coldest point of the year, and then they only burned twice a day, 15-minute fires both times.
Yeah.
And that sounded good to me.
That's pretty awesome. Yeah, I agree. I agree. They're pretty awesome.
And small wood that I could actually carry.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, folks. Appreciate your attention. Stay in touch. Did folks all get cards who needed them with our